Well, hello everyone. Welcome back again. This is day 9, pattern number 9 of our Granny Square Challenge. And we're going to go back to the basics and do a traditional Granny Square. These are like the ultimate scrap busters. This is one that I did a couple years ago. I call it my Roseanne Scrapgan because, they did a reboot of that show and there was her Afghan laying over the back of her sofa and I'm like, I have to have one of those. So that's what I did. I just got out all this different scraps and there's so many different colors in this. It's ridiculous. And I made one, but we're not going to use that many colors today. That's a lot of color changing. And I did it in like assembly line style. Like did one part of the square, then the next part of the square. Okay, this is what we're going to do today. We're going to use 2 colors and just do a classic granny square. So I have coral and teal, as you can see. And I'm going to, as with all granny squares, make a circle. And you can do a magic circle if you know how to do that. But if you don't know how to do a classic granny square, you probably don't know how to do the magic circle. But I'm going to do a slip knot and chain 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to join into my first chain to make a little circle with a slip stitch, and then I'm going to chain 3 and do 2 double crochets into the center of the circle. Make sure you get into the center, that you're not working into one of the chain stitches, and that forms our first cluster. So then we're going to chain 2 and do another cluster, which is 3 double crochets to form the granny cluster. Chain 2 and do another cluster. Chain 2, and we're going to do another cluster. Chain 2, and we're going to slip stitch it to the top of our beginning chain 3 of the first cluster and fasten off. And we have one teeny tiny little granny square. And yes, granny squares create a lot of ends to work in. All right, color number 2, slip knot. And you're going to join in any corner. I'm going to join with a standing double. So you have your slip knot on your hook. You're going to yarn over and hold it in place with your thumb. Go through your corner. Yarn over. Pull through 2. And then pull through 2. And that just gets rid of the ugly chain 3. So we're going to do a cluster of 3. We've already done 1. That's 2 and 3. That forms a granny cluster, 3 double crochets, chain 2, and do 3 more. That is our first corner formed. Now, some people will chain 1 in between these stitches, some people will not. When I was taught as a kid, I was taught to chain 1, so that is what I do. Chain 1, and then I jump over to the next corner and do a cluster, which is 3 double crochets, chain 2. Some people chain 3 there. That's just personal preference. And do another cluster in the same corner. Chain 1, come over to the next corner and do a cluster. Chain 2 and another cluster in the same space. Chain 1 and jump over to the next corner and do a cluster, chain 2 and a cluster. Chain 1 and join to our first double crochet and fasten off. And that is how we look now with 2 rounds. So you can work in your ends as you go or not. I'll be back in a second. I'm going to work mine in so they don't get in my way and make me crazy. All right, so we look like this. Now we're getting ready to go to round 3. So I'm going back to my coral color. And again, slip knot onto the hook, yarn over, hold it with your thumb wherever you feel like you want to start. We're going to do a standing double, 2 more doubles to form the cluster. Chain 2 because we started in a corner, and do another cluster. Chain 1, come over to the center, the chain 1 space there, and do a cluster. Chain 1, oops, move over to the corner, and it is a cluster. A chain 2, and another cluster. We just made a corner. We're going to chain 1, come over to this chain 1 space and do a cluster. Chain 1, and move over to the corner and do a cluster. Chain 2, do another cluster in the same place. Chain 1, move over to the chain 1 space and do a cluster. Chain 1, off to the corner there, doing a cluster, and a chain 2, and another cluster. chain 1, cluster in the chain 1 space, chain 1, and fasten off to the beginning, or slip stitch and then fasten off, and cut. Okay, so we've done 3 rounds. Now you can start to see a little pattern happening here. Our first round, all we had was 4 corners. In our second round, we have our 4 corners, but we also have 1 space in between. When we got to our third round, we have our corners, and now we have 2 spaces in between. So each round, you should gain a space on each side. So let's move on to our next color after I get rid of my ends. Okay, back to our teal. Slip knot, yarn over, hold it with your thumb so you don't lose it. Start wherever you want to start. I'm in a corner. Get out of the way. We're going to do our standing double. Yarn over and do 2 more doubles for a cluster. Chain 2. And do another cluster in the corner. Chain 1, jump over to the chain 1 space and do a cluster. Now every single round is worked the same, with the exception that you will grow by 1 cluster per round on each side. So I'm going to finish this round off on my own and come back on camera when I'm done with it. So in the corners, remember, it's a cluster, which is 3 double crochets, a chain 2, and then another cluster. And along the sides, you will always chain 1 in between each clusters if you do it this way. If not, if you do not want to chain 1, you do not have to. That is totally up to you. That's completely optional. It's just the way I prefer to do it. So let's get rolling, and I'll meet you back when I get finished with this round. Okay, so I finished my round. That's 4 rounds, and you can keep going. You can make these things as big as you want. You can make a whole blanket out of one great big old square, but as it gets bigger, the longer it takes to get around the edges. So this was my first example, where I started with the teal, and then went to coral, and then we just did the coral to the teal. So if you're only using 2 colors and you alternated it like that, so you could do coral, teal, then the next square would be coral. Or there's so many different ways you can set up your squares. It isn't funny. But anyhow, that is the classic granny. Easy peasy. And this was day 9, pattern number 9 of the Granny Square Challenge. And I will see you again on day 10 for pattern number 10. And thank you so much. You're appreciated.